All right. Hello, colleagues. This is another trial run of topic 2 within module 1 to address the issues of nutrients. And again, this will be a practice run. Here goes. So welcome back to module 1, Introductory Concepts in Nutrition. This video will address topic number 2, nutrients in food. This work is a collaborative project conducted by ANRCB. And what we hope in this video and in this topic is that participants will be able to recognize some key essential nutrients and understand their associated deficiencies, and then be able to identify strategies to prevent deficiencies in macro and micronutrients. So let's begin by talking about what nutrients are. These are chemical compounds that are found in food and beverages that are essential to human life and human health. So they're chemicals, they're biochemical substances that are used by the body and are required and must be supplied through food and drink. They could be used for growth, for having energy to do things. They can have a role in immune function and other kinds of processes within the body. While most of nutrients will come from food or drink, different foods have different nutrients and they come in different amounts. And so that's why the choices of foods are important for good nutrition. So we can talk about where food comes from and classify foods by their origin or their function. So some foods are of plant origin, some are of animal origin. These foods can be important for growth and development. These are often foods such as animal foods or lentils or beans. They can give us energy for daily activities. So things that are like cereals, like rice or noodles, sugar, those go into that energy giving function. And some are protective, that protect us from disease. So fruits and vegetables and milk are good examples. And these various foods then contain these different kinds of nutrients. And so let me get the pointer. We have carbohydrates that come from some of these energy-giving foods, fats and oils that we use for cooking and eating, protein, which can come from animal foods or nuts, or lentils or beans, and then vitamins and minerals that come from a range of foods. So we'll talk about all of these categories in some greater detail. So first of all, we can classify all these various nutrients into two groups, the macronutrients and the micronutrients. The macronutrients are large chemical compounds. The micronutrients are small chemical compounds. So macronutrients include carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Micronutrients are minerals and vitamins. And then there are some differences among these micronutrients, and we will discuss these a bit more. Carbohydrates can be simple or complex. Fats can be saturated or unsaturated. Vitamins can be soluble in fat or water. These affect the properties, the absorption of these nutrients, how much is stored within your body, how quickly those nutrients are metabolized and used by your body. So the chemical structure certainly matters. But we'll talk about this very briefly. So starting with carbohydrates, they can be simple or they can be complex. So simple ones have one or two sugar units. So think of glucose, right? Think about table sugar or sweet beverages like Coca-Cola. Those would contain these simple carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates are starches, for example. These are things that you find in our daily foods, such as rice, noodles, or potatoes. Those are also energy giving. Proteins come from animal sources or come from lentils or beans. These are also macronutrients. They're large molecules. They're made of component parts called amino acids. And there are many amino acids, some of which our bodies can produce and some of which we must eat. And so the quality of the protein that we eat is determined by how much of these essential amino acids are present. So eating a diverse diet, and this will be a common message throughout this topic, eating a diverse diet is important to get these different essential amino acids. And when we don't have all of them, we say that a protein is incomplete. So examples of protein sources, as I said, are various animal foods, and that includes animals of land and of water, so fish as well, milk. It can be soy products like tofu. It can be beans and lentils and so on. Now, another micronutrient includes our fats. These have various classifications. They can be saturated, unsaturated, or trans fats. And again, these are distinctions in chemical structure. Saturated fats, we know them because at room temperature, they're solid. These are often better consumed in small quantities, that the amount eaten should be limited. Examples of this might be animal fat or butter. Unsaturated fats tend to be liquid at room temperature. These are generally more healthy. So think about soybean oil or any kind of vegetable oil would be in that category. Trans fats are not healthy and shouldn't be consumed. So certain foods, especially foods that you will purchase that have been fried, can potentially include trans fats. Now, the smaller nutrients, again, those are called micronutrients. These serve various functions within the body, often at a cellular level. They can include minerals, for example, iron or zinc. And they're usually, even when they're elements, they're usually not consumed as elements. They might come as a small compound, and the chemical form in which we eat them and consume them affects how well our bodies can use that nutrient. So the availability of that to our body depends on the chemical form that they are found within food. Vitamins are another group. These are slightly larger compounds, but still small. They might be soluble in fat or in water. In general, fat-soluble vitamins can be stored by the body, whereas water-soluble vitamins cannot be stored for long. If you consume a lot of them, then your body will take what it needs and then remove the rest. And so this has an important, this has significance because fat-soluble vitamins can be given in doses that are then maintained by your body, even if you have some deficiency in your diet later. So minerals and vitamins come from all sorts of food, usually in small quantities. And again, that is where having that diverse diet. Foods that are perishable, for example, fruits and vegetables and fish and meat, tend to be good sources of these micronutrients. So that's our understanding of nutrients, and there are many of these. I've just given you a very quick summary. But when you are speaking to people, when you're talking to patients in a clinic or you're talking to community members, people do not have a lot of awareness necessarily of nutrients. What they know is food. And so when we're communicating with them, we talk about how to achieve a balanced diet. And a balanced diet involves a diversity of foods where you eat enough of different sorts of foods to allow us to meet all of our nutritional requirements, both for macro and for micronutrients. So Laos has dietary guidelines that classify foods into 6 categories, and has recommendations of how much of each category to eat every day in order to achieve this balanced diet. And that is a way of ensuring adequacy of nutrition within a population. So the 6 groups involve, as we can see here, these kind of starchy staple foods, vegetables, fruits of any kind, foods that are high in calcium. So thinking of milk, of very certain kinds of insects, foods that are high in protein, animal foods of various kinds, or eggs, or beans, meats, and then foods in smaller quantities that are high in fat. That can be cooking oil or coconut or other things, including animal fat as well. Not mentioned here, but also important is water, of having adequate amounts of water for health and well-being. So when we don't have adequate nutrition and we don't have good consumption of nutrients, then we have various forms of malnutrition. And it's common to think of this as not having enough. We will also, as we progress in this module, also talk about problems of having excess, especially excess macronutrients. So let's talk about the different forms of malnutrition. There's this idea of undernutrition that has to do with when you're lacking energy or protein. So it's kind of a macronutrient type of issue. You can have overnutrition when you have too many calories in your diet. You can also have something that is called hidden hunger, and we will talk about this more in this video. And that involves a deficiency of one or more micronutrients. The causes for this malnutrition, we've talked about a lot of levels of causes, but we want to highlight some immediate points. So first is, in terms of immediate causes, we know not eating enough nutrients can lead to malnutrition, especially hidden hunger or undernutrition. But there are other things that can happen as well. So for example, if you have some sort of certain kinds of infection, for example, if a baby has a diarrheal disease, that can affect that baby's ability to take the nutrients in food and then bring it into the body. So that absorption, the nutrients are eaten, but they're not absorbed. Another example is where perhaps nutrients are indeed absorbed, but the needs of a person are increased because they might have an illness, for example, or they might be at a certain stage of life. For example, a woman may be pregnant or nursing a baby. So again, here we have different forms of malnutrition. This is, and then we can think of specific outcomes. So when we talk about undernutrition, this can manifest itself in different ways. We have, in the last topic, we talked about stunting, where a child is not very tall for their age. Wasting, when a child in particular is skinny, or a person of any age is too thin. Nutritional edema involves a swelling of the body, and that can be in certain cases. Overnutrition can manifest itself in overweight and obesity. And then we have this micronutrient deficiency, which is sometimes called hidden hunger. There are different kinds of micronutrient deficiencies, and not all of them have very clear clinical symptoms that you can observe. So we can classify these types of disorders as type 1 or type 2. The type 1 have a certain clinical manifestation, and we'll give some examples as we go forward. The type 2 don't have a very prominent clinical manifestation. You might see it in children as poor growth, but nothing very specific. So type 1 nutrients include things like iron, thiamine, niacin, vitamin A, vitamin C. We'll talk about a few of these in some more detail later in this topic. So the challenge that most countries of the world face is that there's usually not just one type of malnutrition. This figure shows the number of countries that have multiple problems. So for example, we have 26 countries in the world that have significant problems with anemia in women of reproductive age and child stunting. We have 41 countries in the world where there is a problem with stunting in children, but also overweight and anemia in women. So what you have are these multiple burdens of malnutrition within a country. And so that poses a lot of a lot of challenge in terms of policies and response and burdens within the health system, burdens within families as they're dealing with multiple problems that might all have different causes. And what's interesting is that this kind of this common occurrence of malnutrition happens not only at the individual level, it can happen within the same community, it can even happen in the same household. For example, you might have parents who are overweight, but they have stunted children. In many countries, this is true. It is actually also possible for one person to have multiple problems. So there's 16 million or more children who have both stunting or wasting. Many of these children may also have anemia, but then there are also children, more than 8 million in the world, who are both stunted and overweight. And so this really is a puzzle that hasn't been solved, of why even in one person that they could have these different forms. What are the causes of these kinds of malnutrition, and what can be done? These are very important open questions. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about what we mean by hidden hunger. It's a strange term to say that a hunger might be hidden. So hidden hunger is when you don't have the feeling of hunger, but your health is affected. When you have, for certain micronutrients, when the deficiency is mild or moderate, there will be no visible change or clinical symptom that can identify that deficiency, but a person is still affected. And it's only when that deficiency gets even worse that you have clinical symptoms that appear. And when you do see clinical symptoms in a population or in a community, what that is indicating is not a problem of a few people, but of many more people who have deficiency. So let me give an example. Here's the story of vitamin A deficiency. So if you have deficiency developing in a population, it starts out with having a deficit within the diet that is over a long period of time. Sorry, I'm having some trouble here. Okay. As this continues, this will lead to a depletion within the body of that nutrient. And as that continues even further, you start having systemic effects within the body. So you might find that immune function is impaired or compromised. You might see production of blood or the growth of bone being affected. As this continues and worsens, only then do you start seeing clinical symptoms. So this effect on your immune system can make you more vulnerable to infectious disease. Effects on blood production can lead to anemia. Effects on bone growth in children can lead to reduced growth. As you go along, it's only in these very extreme forms of deficiency where you see clinical symptoms. And for vitamin A, those symptoms are usually in the eyes. So there can be, for example, spots on the eye or night blindness. And this will be much more readily observable. These are much harder to identify. And so what you find, and as this goes along, also the risk of mortality is increasing. So the message here is that if you do see some level of night blindness, for example, in a population, what that means is that there is probably a substantial proportion of the population that is suffering from deficiency and that it's affecting growth and development and health without being visible. And hence, this is why it's called hidden hunger. When we look at micronutrient deficiencies, there are many vitamins and minerals, but there are some big ones. So this is looking at zinc, iron, vitamin A, and iodine, which globally are the four biggest areas of concern when it comes to micronutrients. And this is the color here indicates the severity of the hidden hunger for these nutrients. The blue dots indicate the extent of iodine deficiency. So bigger dots are more deficiency, and the dark orange color is more concern about hidden hunger here. If you look at the actual numbers for these kinds of micronutrient deficiencies, we are talking about billions of people who are affected throughout the world. Now, let me give you a little bit of detail on some of these big nutrients. So I mentioned vitamin A. Vitamin A comes from animal sources, from vegetables and fruits that are orange or dark green. Sometimes they come from supplementation that is given to children, and having deficiency is, as we discussed in the earlier slide, can affect vision, immune system, and other processes. Iodine is a mineral. You can find it in seaweed, seafood. You can find it in supplements and fortified products like iodized salt. A lack of iodine, an extreme deficiency of iodine can affect mental function, growth, and development of especially of fetuses and babies and children. It can cause goiter, which appears as a swelling in the neck related to the thyroid. Iron is another very important mineral. Can come from animal foods, red meats, for example. It can also come from plant sources. For example, beans, dark green leafy vegetables are good sources. It can be fortified into products. Iron can lead to anemia. It can ultimately lead to poor outcomes, especially during pregnancy. It can affect mental health. It can affect growth and development and children's ability to learn, people's ability to work. Iron has a lot of consequences. Folic acid comes from a variety of sources as well. Folic acid is important, especially in early pregnancy, where a lack of folic acid for a woman who is pregnant in the very early stages can lead to birth defects in the baby that can be quite consequential. Can also lead to a form of anemia. Zinc comes from a variety of sources. Most foods don't have a lot of it, and so a diverse diet certainly helps. There are various kinds of consequences that are very difficult to identify as specific to zinc. So there might be growth restriction, immune effects. It's very hard to have a very clear association. Zinc is one of those type 2 nutrients that don't have a very clear clinical manifestation. Thiamine, vitamin B1 is a nutrient of concern, certainly in Laos. Can come from whole grains, from meat, from fish. It can be a fortified nutrient within something like infant formula. And deficiency, extreme deficiency has clinical symptoms that can affect muscles and weight and so on, as well as like kind of cognitive and mental effects as well. The deficiency is referred to as beriberi. So there are many other nutrients. Those are some of the big ones, the issues of concern. But let me talk now about kind of the bigger consequences of nutrition. Certainly for an individual, for their health, and sometimes even their survival, nutrition is important. But there are also other costs at a larger level. So beyond these individual effects that have to do with health and well-being and mental health, and ability to work and to care for children, we also have larger societal effects. So people's ability to work, if there's a high level of malnutrition, that will affect the productivity of a nation. It can affect the nation's economic development and development over time and over generations. And so this can be a cycle that leads to development that is slowed down as a country, higher levels of poverty. And as we'll talk about as we go forward, these issues of stalled development and certainly poverty then can also create this cycle that leads to individual deprivation. So this can be a negative cycle that needs to be addressed. So how do we address particularly micronutrient deficiency, since that is so widespread throughout the world? There are a few strategies, and the best approaches are always to do multiple strategies at the same time. So in an ideal case, all people will have a very diverse diet so that they eat many types of food. They achieve the balanced diet that we discussed, and therefore can meet their nutritional needs. That is the ideal, but can be very difficult to achieve. So in the short term, we might do something like supplementation. This is where you give a chemical preparation, for example, a capsule or a syrup for a baby, capsules for a pregnant mother, for example, and that immediately addresses their need. This is a very appropriate strategy, for example, during pregnancy. You might have fortification. This is where we add nutrients to foods, where people can go to the market and purchase them and then cook and eat and receive nutrition in that way. And then there are other public health measures that also affect overall health. So having immunization, dealing with parasites such as malaria or intestinal worms, making sure people have clean water so that they stay healthy, that they don't have infection, especially diarrhea, that will affect our abilities to remain healthy, to absorb all the nutrient that is consumed. And that can help prevent deficiencies as well. So in summary, what we see is that there are many nutrients, different kinds. They all have important functions, and that's why they're essential. Lacking them can lead to a wide range of health consequences. Sometimes the health consequences are not visible or easily detected, and that leads to deficiencies that we call hidden hunger. A strategy, ultimately the best strategy is to have a diverse and balanced diet so that every person can have adequate amounts of all nutrients. Having malnutrition in any kind of form has consequences immediately, can have consequences later in life. It can have consequences for the next generation, for your children and their children, and it can have consequences for the society and the country as well. There are multiple strategies that can be used to address these problems, and ultimately the best approach is to take several strategies at once to deal with the issues of malnutrition. All right, thank you for your attention. And this ends module 2.